A common theme does exist among people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism, specifically their tendency to exhibit both behavioral and cognitive rigidity, which spouses often perceive as stubbornness and being insensitive, selfish, uncaring, narcissistic, and numerous other adjectives. But the behavioral and cognitive rigidity that gets perceived as just rude behavior is definitely a response to anxiety. There's a strong correlation between anxiety and inflexibility, and that can be evident at home, and it also can be evident in the workplace. So a vulnerability to anxiety is definitely an intrinsic feature of Asperger's or high-functioning autism, and that's due to three different things, really. It's due to a specific neurotransmitter system defect. It's also due to a breakdown in circuitry related to extinguishing fear responses. And it's also a secondary consequence of the individual's inability to make appropriate social judgments. So there's numerous factors at play that increase anxiety in people on the autism spectrum. I could spend the next hour talking about that, but I'll try to keep this answer fairly short. A lack of empathy significantly limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. For example, the individual is unaware in many cases that he has said hurtful things or behaved in inappropriate ways. And this results in him, we'll use the example of an NT wife and the husband with autism. This behavior that he exhibits often gets him in trouble with his wife. I work with men on the autism spectrum a lot, and it seems like they all say, yeah, they're in the doghouse, and they feel like they're always in trouble. So this all relates to a lack of empathy, or we will call it a lack of displayed empathy. They have empathy, they just don't necessarily display it. And this limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. Social problem solving, that's an important term to remember. Limitations in generalizing from one situation to another often contribute to in this case, the autistic husband repeating the same social mistakes over and over again. If he gets into a heated argument with his NT wife over a specific problem, and she conveys to him what he needs to do differently next time, he will get it with that specific problem. But if there's a second problem that's just slightly different, he may not necessarily be able to generalize from the first problem to the second problem. Also, another factor that is at play that increases anxiety is the individual's inability to grasp social cues, facial expressions, body language, and so on. So this creates a lot of repeated social errors because he's misinterpreting what is being expressed to him. Social limitations also make it difficult for him to develop coping strategies to soothe himself and to contain difficult emotions. And so those are just a few. There's many more. The circumstances that raise the anxiety level for people on the autism spectrum often result in their increased need to control people, places, and things. This need for control takes the form of rigidity, which is what you were referring to in your question as stubbornness. So there's behavioral rigidity and cognitive rigidity. Behavioral rigidity refers to the person's difficulty in maintaining appropriate behavior in new and unfamiliar situations. Okay? And then there's cognitive rigidity, and this occurs when the individual is unable to consider alternatives to the current situation, alternative viewpoints, or innovative solutions to a problem. People with rigid thinking do tend to view situations in either or terms. It's either right or wrong, good, bad, black, white. They want concrete black and white answers, and the gray areas of life are often very uncomfortable for people with behavioral and cognitive rigidity. Symptoms of rigidity often introduce some of the most disruptive chronic behaviors exhibited by people on the autism spectrum. For example, aggression, difficulties tolerating changes in routine, dislike of changes to plans that have been previously laid out. You may have experienced with your partner on the spectrum his or her meltdowns, frustration, shutdowns, and problems with minor differences in the environment. I get a lot of feedback from NT wives that say they feel that they're always walking on eggshells in an effort to circumvent any extreme reaction from their very brittle Asperger's husband. In addition, the husband himself may articulate his anxiety over fears that things will not go according to plan, or that he'll be forced to make changes that he can't handle. Sometimes these behaviors are identified as obsessive compulsive because of the husband's need for ritualized order or non-functional routine. In other words, he has a strong need for sameness. So, as one can easily imagine, behavioral and cognitive rigidity causes many problems in relationships, which usually result in a higher level of anxiety for the person on the autism spectrum. Therefore, this cycle just continues at that point. Since my social intelligence and emotional intelligence is low, I have a hard time reading body language, facial cues, tone of voice, volume of voice, filling in between the lines when somebody's somewhat vague. Since I have this mind blindness issue where I'm not really sure what people's motives are, I'm not really sure what's going on inside of their thinking process, I'm not really sure what they're feeling in their heart, I'm not really sure what they're planning. I have a hard time predicting outcomes based on this misinformation that I'm getting because I have this mind blindness thing. So what ends up happening is I'm always in a state of confusion because I never really totally know what the hell's going on. And I'm like dodging paintballs all day. I'm trying to figure out, okay, what is this person thinking, or what are they feeling? Is it my fault? Is it something else? And there's this guesswork that goes on all goddamn day long. And so since you're in a constant state of confusion and guesswork, as you well can imagine, causes a lot of anxiety. Because I never know what the hell's going on. I'm always trying to guess what's going on. So I am literally in a heightened state of anxiety to one degree or another. I'm never not anxious unless I'm engaging in my special interest. But for the most part, I'm in some form of anxiety all day long. What do I do when I'm anxious 24/7? I probably even have anxious dreams. So what do I do in that case? I engage in anxiety reduction. Since I'm anxious all the time, I do as many things as I know how to reduce my anxiety. But I have found in many cases the individual's anxiety reduction techniques at the very best only work temporarily, and in many cases not even temporarily. But in most cases, the anxiety reduction techniques, which would be anger, rage, shutdowns, meltdowns, whatever, I mean, the list is long. Their anxiety reduction technique actually increases the anxiety. I often get a lot of neurotypical spouses wanting to inquire about why their partner with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism has meltdowns. And I got an email recently, and I get a lot of these, and in essence, this is a neurotypical wife, and she's wanting to understand more fully why her Asperger's husband has meltdowns. Before we can address that, we'll have to look at anxiety, because a meltdown or a shutdown is a result of high anxiety. And so you could think of a meltdown as simply a symptom of anxiety. If your husband, for example, who has Asperger's syndrome, goes into a meltdown or a shutdown, you can bet that what preceded that was something that raised his anxiety. We'll just call this the anxiety cycle, and a meltdown will be part of this cycle. So unfortunately, it's very common for people with Asperger's to experience more than their fair share of stress. And honestly, to make matters worse, many of these people lack the ability to manage their stress effectively. They've come up with some coping mechanisms to deal with it, and unfortunately, many of these mechanisms are dysfunctional. In other words, they kind of make a bad problem worse, or they solve the problem temporarily only. So individuals with Asperger's are particularly prone to anxiety disorders as a consequence of the social demands made on them. Any social contact can generate anxiety as to how to start, maintain, and end the activity or conversation. Changes to daily routine can exacerbate the anxiety, and also certain sensory sensitivities can also contribute to that. Many of my clients have reported feeling anxious for no apparent reason at all. They were fine the previous day, they wake up, they get started with their day, and for some reason they're anxious, and they can't pinpoint it. They can't attribute it to any particular event or something that somebody said or did. So not only do people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism experience anxiety, oftentimes it's random and for no apparent reason. Perhaps some of these individuals take life too seriously. Perhaps they take others' behavior and comments too personally, and perhaps they just generally view themselves as worrywarts, and so they've kind of labeled themselves that way. And so chronically worrying that something bad will happen or something good won't happen has honestly just become a habit. And that's an important concept. Once you have anxiety for a period of time, it actually becomes a habit, and it operates at an unconscious level. So that's the first thing that happens in this business that relates to a meltdown, is the anxiety piece. What follows then is the need for anxiety reduction, of course. Nobody can go through day after day, 365 days a week under high anxiety without having some kind of problem or searching for some kind of remedy. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, unfortunately, in many cases, their anxiety reduction techniques actually create more problems or further their anxiety or drive people away or can result in school suspension, job loss, divorce, and so on. So they do try to manage their anxiety in healthful ways. They think for example, distracting themselves by engaging in their special interest for excessive amounts of time. Some people turn to marijuana, some people turn to alcohol, various things, and some work to some degree, some don't work at all, and some only work temporarily. But the two main things that they do for anxiety reduction would be, of course, the shutdown, and that is where they just hibernate. They just want to be by themselves, and they withdraw, don't want to talk to anybody. They just want to temporarily take a time out and escape from the world. And then the other thing they do, the opposite end of the spectrum of a shutdown, would be the meltdown, and that's what we're trying to address today. So as this anxiety, whatever its cause, builds up and builds up, eventually the dam breaks, so to speak, usually over something very small. It's literally the straw that breaks the camel's back. Under severe enough stress, any normally calm and collected person with Asperger's may become totally out of control and have a huge explosion. And that's usually what people see when they see somebody having a meltdown. So those who experience meltdowns are often perceived by others as always being angry. I hear from neurotypical spouses all the time that their Asperger's husband only shows anger. When he's sad, it shows up as anger. If he's mad, it shows up as anger. If he's depressed, all he displays is anger. Even though they do have several emotions underneath there, they only show the surface emotion, which is anger. Rage may be a common reaction experienced when coming to terms with problems in employment, relationships, friendships, and other areas in life affected by Asperger's. There is often this on-off quality to the person's rage, where the person may be calm minutes later after a meltdown, while the people around are stunned and shocked that what they just witnessed. And so in this case, the Asperger's man is, after he's had his meltdown, 5 minutes later he's fine, and everybody else is still going, what the hell happened, and they're still in a state of shock. Neurotypical spouses often struggle to understand these meltdowns, with resentment and bitterness often building up over time. In some cases, the Asperger's individual may not even acknowledge he has trouble with rage, and he will blame others for provoking him. And as you can well imagine, this creates a lot of conflict in the marriage. There would literally be hundreds of examples of how meltdowns can play out, but for the sake of this video here, we're going to just discuss the following example, and we'll apply this example throughout. So, let's say the Asperger's individual's had a rough day at work, but he was able to kind of maintain his composure for the most part through the day. But when he gets home, his wife makes a comment that she didn't think was particularly provoking or upsetting, but that hits the man wrong for some reason, and he explodes. So in other words, he kind of takes out his anxiety that he experienced through the day. He takes that out on his wife, unintentionally, of course. I mean, it wasn't premeditated. He didn't think on the way home, I'm going to give my wife hell when I walk in the door. But he was already in a position where he was about to explode, and it didn't take much more steam to blow the lid off of that kettle. So the next phase in this anxiety cycle is guilt. And we're going to use the example of the guy coming home from work, okay? So if this particular scenario plays itself out numerous times over months and years, in other words, it seems to be a theme or a pattern that he always comes home in a bad mood and to one degree or another takes it out on his wife, the Asperger's husband in this case will come to believe that he's the victim of his emotions. In this case, work-related stress expressed in the form of misplaced anger toward his wife. But not only does he feel like a victim of circumstances, he also feels an element of guilt and remorse for hurting the people that he loves. He may have tried numerous times to avoid repeating this scenario, where he comes home and he knows he's taking out his anger on his wife when really it should have been directed at the coworker that pissed him off earlier in the day. But even though he tries to avoid the meltdown, he still has this work-related stress that's unresolved, and he hasn't figured out a way to deal with this stress in a functional, non-destructive way. So since he keeps repeating this same cycle that he doesn't want to repeat, he's beginning to feel very guilty about the whole damn thing. So what do you do when you have ongoing toxic guilt? Well, what happens next in this cycle is self-punishment. As a result of repeated social failures, in other words, in this case, numerous negative encounters with his wife, the person with Asperger's may come to the conclusion that he doesn't deserve love, he doesn't deserve compassion, he doesn't deserve to have a peaceful lifestyle. Therefore, he may do destructive things to punish himself. For example, beating up on himself with negative self-talk, drinking or drug use, overeating, isolation, and possibly even separation or divorce. In other words, he's the one that initiates separation or divorce because he thinks that he deserves that. Guilt is supposed to be a pro-social emotion. In other words, it functions to preserve important relationships. But many people with Asperger's who experience repeated exposures to this anxiety cycle that we're talking about here have unresolved guilt, which literally prevents them from enjoying life and thriving emotionally. Instead, they're just trying to survive life, and they're just trying to survive emotionally. So the whole thing started off with anxiety. He tried to reduce his anxiety, in this case with numerous dysfunctional methods that didn't work. And so since he couldn't come up with an anxiety reduction method that worked, he went to the default meltdown. In other words, the anxiety built up so much that he couldn't even engage in any kind of hopeful interventions at that point. It was just explosion time. Then he feels guilty for these explosions. Then he punishes himself for these explosions, and we've gone full circle right back to anxiety again, because all of these different steps in the cycle are hugely stressful. So months or even years of experiencing numerous negative emotions, stress, frustration, anger, rage, guilt, and so on, obviously can make relationships so problematic that the better option becomes living alone or avoiding human contact as much as possible. In many cases, the man gets divorced and he just decides, I'm never getting married again. I'm never going to try this love thing again. I suck at it and I hurt people and I'm just better off left to my own company. But unfortunately, all of us are social creatures by nature. As human beings, we need other people. Therefore, living a life of solitude carries its own element of anxiety because people need other people. And so when he chooses a solitary lifestyle, he's by default chosen to make his anxiety even worse.